This tiny island in the Indian Ocean is controlling China, and could become China's worst nightmare the moment it tries to mess with India. Here's an incident that proves this. Soon after the Galwan clash, the Indian Navy deployed its frontline vessels along the Malacca Strait. Around the same time, the Indian Navy, swiftly but quietly avoiding any public attention, sailed out its frontline warship for deployment in the South China Sea, where it was continuously maintaining contact with its US counterparts. In fact, these moves made China so uncomfortable that they raised objections about the Indian warship's presence during the diplomatic-level talks with the Indian side. But it's not what you think. These talks were not regarding some tensions in the Indian Ocean, but rather to ease off tensions in the Galwan region. But the question is, if both sides met to discuss resolving the conflict in Ladakh, why did China become so uneasy and raise objections about a move happening thousands of miles away from the conflict zone? The simple answer is that the Malacca Strait is known as China's primary maritime lifeline, and it's obvious to raise concerns over enemy movement in a region that almost controls your entire country's economy. But you have still not heard about the scariest part. Because these Indian islands, known as the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, as you can see here, are just 1,029 kilometers, or about 640 miles away from the Malacca Strait. In fact, the last Indian island of the Andaman and Nicobar archipelago, the Great Nicobar Island, is just 90 kilometers, or about 56 miles, from the western entrance of the Strait of Malacca. This means India holds a significant deterrent against China in the Indian Ocean, and can block this route and cripple the Chinese economy in no time. In fact, even in the case of a full-scale war, despite having fewer warships and submarines than China, these islands could give India a significant edge over the Chinese Navy. So, let's understand. Why is the Malacca Strait known as a lifeline for China? Let's zoom out of the map and look at China now. What we can see is a hammer and sickle and a red color around it. Sorry guys, an editing mistake. Anyway, China's economy survives on this one route called the Malacca Strait. The Strait of Malacca is a strategic waterway between Indonesia and Malaysia, through which almost 67% of China's maritime trade and 80% of its oil imports passes through. In fact, it's not just China. More than 1/3 of all worldwide trade passes through the Malacca Strait. So the Malacca Strait getting blocked would be a nightmare, not just for China, but really for the entire world. And blocking such a point is much easier because all it takes is a few ships to block this very narrow route. And the last time such an incident occurred, the world faced a whopping loss of $54 billion in just 6 days. In March of 2021, this ship named Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, and on the same day, oil prices jumped about 6%. And that too, this 6% was when the world was facing the COVID pandemic. So this number could have been much higher if there was no pandemic at that time. The Suez Canal blockage roughly cost 12% of global trade and was holding up trade valued at almost $9 billion per day. And since the ship was stuck for the 6 days, the overall trade loss has been roughly estimated around $54 billion. So now you know why such a location is extremely important. And this is also why such locations are referred to as choke points. But why am I telling you all of this? Because this is where the game of geopolitics and deterrence comes into play. If a country near the choke point decides to block this route for a rival nation, it could literally bring that country to its knees. And this is where China's worst nightmare would become a reality. A nightmare the Chinese themselves named as the Malacca Dilemma. And you heard that right, it's not a US or a European expert who coined this term, but the Chinese president himself. The Malacca Dilemma is a word coined in 2003 by former Chinese President Hu Jintao. It basically represents the threat of an entity choking its oil imports. But who? At the first glance, it looks like the countries very close to the strait are Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Myanmar. Now, these countries might not block this route for China for a variety of reasons, ranging from political to economic factors. And maybe most of them don't even have a rivalry with China. Or I would say they don't dare to block this route because of China's military might. Yeah, it's a harsh truth, and we all have to see how China uses its military might to bully countries. But if you look closely, at the end of the Malacca Strait, you will notice some tiny islands. Or I won't be wrong to replace the word tiny islands with China's worst nightmare. The question is, if big countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Myanmar won't dare to block these Chinese ships, then how is this group of tiny islands even thinking of it? Well, because it's part of one of the few countries in the Asian continent fighting back against China, and that is India. And while most people just know this India, they actually miss these critical islands of the country, the islands that are controlling China. India can use these islands as a strategic deterrent against China, as India can block Chinese SLOCs, or sea lines of communications, which are basically the primary primary maritime routes used for trade, military, and other purposes. We will discuss all the details regarding this in a few minutes, but in reality, it's just not what you think. Let me explain. The fact that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands also served as a strategic pit stop for naval vessels of partner countries, including Japan, the United States, Australia, and France, makes it even worse for China. This simply means that the naval vessels of these countries can make brief stops for refueling, maintenance, or restocking supplies while they are on their way to their destinations. So, along with India, this gives a huge advantage to the United States, Japan, Australia, and France to pause during operations in the Indian Oceans or before entering Southeast China and the South China Sea. And this enables faster responses to strategic or emergency situations, especially against China. And why China? Because we all know who is the most mischievous kid in the class. In fact, Sushant Singh, a senior fellow at New Delhi-based think tank, even said that in the event of a military clash between China and the US over Taiwan, the US could ask India for support from the islands. Secondly, these islands are also a very important part of a counter-strategy that India is using against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which is known as the double fish hook strategy. This is a maritime strategy to strengthen India's military hold in the Indian Ocean. But what exactly is this double hook strategy? The first hook starts here, from the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which extends to Sabang Port in Indonesia, Coco Islands in Australia, and ends at the Diego Garcia, which is the US military base in the Chagos Islands. And each of these entities have an agreement with India. This includes a port project agreement with Indonesia, mutual logistics support agreement with Australia, which basically says that India and Australia can use each other's military facilities. And lastly, we have an agreement with the US called the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement, also known as the LEMOA. Even this agreement enables both sides to use each other's military facilities. Now comes the second hook, which starts from the Duqm port of Oman, extends to the French territories and the Reunion Islands, and then to Mauritius. Now, if you draw a connecting line with all these points, you will see that even this hook ends at Diego Garcia. And even for this second hook, India has military agreements with Oman, France, and Mauritius. Because of these hooks, India has a very strong hold over the Indian Ocean. But for China, the biggest threat the Andaman and Nicobar pose, as we saw, is that they could play a critical role in blocking the Chinese oil supplies. But the most important question is, if we know that this is a threat for China, then China must have analyzed this threat way back, right? Then why is China not doing anything to counter this sword hanging over its head? Actually, they did, but here's why they couldn't do much about it. To understand the situation in China better, let's understand the geographical context of this region. If you see the Malacca Strait here, it measures just 1,100 kilometers. It's about 684-ish miles in length. In fact, this point near Singapore, known as the Phillips Channel, as you can see in this map, is so narrow that it is just 2.8 kilometers, or about 1 3/4 miles in width. And this is the narrowest part of the Malacca Strait. When it comes to the side near India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where China faces its biggest threat, the Malacca Strait is just around 400 kilometers, or 250-ish miles wide, between Banda Aceh in Indonesia and Phuket in Thailand. And for such a narrow width, it is way easier to block Chinese ships. In fact, Larry Bond, the renowned naval author, in a podcast said, and I quote, "If India wanted to cut off trade with China, all they would have to do is park a bunch of ships at the Strait of Malacca. And that's it. Nothing else is getting through that way." Now, if you look at the map closely, you might be saying, well, hey, there are so many other routes in the region China can consider, even if India blocks the Malacca Strait. For example, the Sundar, Lombok, and Makassar Straits in the Indonesian archipelago, and even other options like the Sibutu Passage or the Mindoro Strait. So in reality, there are a lot of other options to surpass the Malacca Strait, so just consider alternative routes and the problem is solved, right? Well, actually, the reality is far different. The first alternative is the Sunda Strait. It is 80 kilometers, or about 50-ish miles long, and 24-ish kilometers, or 15 miles wide on the northeastern entrance. And if Chinese ships passed from here, then the threat of facing Indian warships would decrease to a large extent, which is exactly what they need. But what is stopping it from becoming a full-fledged alternative to the Malacca Strait is something that isn't visible on the map, because in reality it has some serious drawbacks. The water in this region flows with powerful, fast-moving currents, making it difficult for ships to pass through safely. On top of that, its shallow waters prevent large ships that are over 100,000 deadweight tons from passing through safely. By the way, deadweight tons, or DWT, is the maximum weight a ship can carry safely, including everything on board like cargo, fuel, and crew. This limit prevents overloading, which makes the ship easier to control in the water. So its uneven seabed, strong currents, and depth limitations make it difficult for vessels that need over 18 meters of water depth to pass through this strait. On top of that, there are risks from many oil drilling platforms just north of Western Java, since oil drilling platforms create obstacles that narrows the passage even further and increases the chances of a collision. And this makes navigating the strait even more challenging. But surprisingly, the next alternative, the Malacca Strait, is wider, deeper, and even less congested than the Strait of Malacca. On top of that, unlike the Sunda Strait, the Malacca Strait has clear navigational channels without major obstacles. This makes it one of the safest routes for supertankers. While the depth across most areas of the Malacca Strait ranges from around 27 to 37 meters, and has enough minimum passage width of 2.8 kilometers or 1.74 miles, the Malacca Strait has a minimum passage of 18.5 kilometers and a depth of more than 150 meters. But this route could increase the shipping cost by around $220 billion per year, and this is for a very simple reason. The strait could add about 1,600 nautical miles, meaning ships would need an extra 3.5 days of travel at their usual speed of 14 to 16 knots. This longer distance raises transportation costs, making these routes less profitable for tanker companies. And for this reason, even this option is less popular than the Malacca Strait. The same is the case even with other alternatives we saw earlier. In fact, China might not even think of using the Sibutu Passage and the Mindoro Strait because they both lie in the Philippines, and we've already talked about how tense the relationship is between China and the Philippines. So, Malacca remains the only feasible option to travel from East Asia to Western Europe via the Suez Canal. I mean, at least for now. And I seriously mean it, because increasing global warming might open another route for China. And while the majority of countries consider global warming as a challenge, it's actually a good sign for a few countries, and China's one of them. You might ask, what has global warming got to do with an alternative trade route? In fact, this route is so efficient that ships passing through the Malacca Strait via the Suez Canal and then reaching to Western Europe have to travel a distance of around 21,000 kilometers, or about 13,000 miles, which takes about 48 days. And if the same ship uses the Northern Sea Route in the Arctic, the distance reduces drastically to 12,800 kilometers, about 1,000 miles, which is less than 35 days. So the Northern Sea Route, or NSR, cuts the distance by 39% as compared to the traditional Suez-Malacca path. But would you be shocked to know that even with the longer distance, around 94,000 ships still pass through the Malacca Strait each year, whereas the NSR just saw 2,994 trips in 2022. If the NSR is shorter than the Malacca Strait, saving both time and money, then why do ships still prefer the Malacca Strait? This is because of the geography of the region the NSR lies in, and the major reason why ships don't prefer this route is actually ice. So even though this route is short, ships can't use it because of the frozen Arctic water. Even if they want to use this route, they must either rely on ice-breaking ships or travel between May and September. That is during the summer season, when the surface ice on the Arctic water is lower. On top of that, in some years, the ice-free period may last as little as 6 weeks. Basically, there's no guarantee when ice-free conditions will start or end. This is where the root cause of the problem lies. Because most cargo ships follow regular schedules known as liner services, where they travel specific routes and stop at various ports to pick up and drop off cargo, this approach is mainly used by container ships, which follow set schedules to keep cargo moving smoothly around the world. The global shipping industry relies on just-in-time delivery, meaning cargo arrives exactly when needed. And for this system to work, shipping companies need reliable, predictable routes, which is very difficult in the case of the Northern Sea Route. But in summers, even if a ship decides to take the NSR, it would have to face the ice drifting into their route due to winds and currents. Plus, Arctic weather can change quickly, with fog, poor visibility, and strong winds, making it hard for ships to stick to their schedules. Also, because of these environmental challenges, the insurance premiums for vessels operating in the Arctic are high due to the increased risk, and this adds on to the overall shipping costs. So, environmental changes, limited infrastructure, and a shortage of icebreakers are some of the major challenges that prevent ships from taking this route. So does this mean this golden route's dream is over for China? Well, probably not. Remember we mentioned about why global warming could be good for some countries? Well, as temperatures rise, Arctic ice will melt more quickly, extending the shipping window and making this route an increasingly attractive option for trade. In fact, from 1979 to 2006, the length of the ice-free season in all seas and straits in the Russian Arctic increased on average from 84 to 129 days, and this will keep increasing as global warming worsens. Additionally, according to the Canadian and American maritime experts, 2% of global shipping could be diverted to the Arctic by 2030, which could reach 5% by 2050. But the problem for China is that this change won't happen in a few years. It could take decades. In fact, analysts expect the Northern Sea Route to be ice-free by 2050, and a study on Arctic marine shipping by the Arctic Council estimates that the NSR will be navigatable without icebreaker help by 2080, and that too is only for 90 to 100 days. But wait a second, I know what question just crossed your mind. It must be, will the NSR solve China's oil problem? Because even though it can help China with an alternative route for its exports to a large extent, when it comes to oil, China is still dependent on the Malacca Strait, right? Actually, the scary fact for China is that 80% of China's oil imports come from the Strait of Malacca. And this is something that the Northern Sea Route cannot solve. The reason is simple. The Northern Sea Route is much longer, which would significantly raise shipping costs. Even when it comes to other sea routes like the Trans-Pacific shipment routes, it doesn't solve China's oil problem. And when it comes to other modes of transportation like air, roads, or railway, here's how it would look. While the average cost of international air freight is between $4 to $8 per kilogram, average cost of rail freight is 80 cents to $3 per kilogram, road freight transport typically ranges from about 50 cents to $2 per kilogram, whereas ocean freight comes in at just 30 cents to 50 cents per kilogram, making it the cheapest option by far to transport goods. So sea transportation is the king, and this is proven by the fact that 90% of traded goods are shipped by sea that is using water transportation. And when it comes to shipping via waters, we have already seen who rules the shipping lanes, at least when it comes to the Chinese shipments, which is none other than the Malacca Strait. Now you know the reason why the Malacca Strait is considered the OG despite so many alternatives. In fact, this is what makes it the scariest fact for China. And these Indian islands are making it scarier by each passing day. And as we mentioned earlier, these islands could help India win against the Chinese Navy despite having a lesser number of ships and submarines. But how? As we've already seen that the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are very close to the Malacca Strait, and this serves as a threat to China. But what is India doing to make them more scary for China? The Andaman and Nicobar are 572 islands, with the Andaman group having 325 islands, while the Nicobar group has 247 islands, out of which only 38 of them are inhabited. This line is known as the 10-degree channel, which is approximately 150 kilometers or about 93 miles wide, and 10 kilometers or about 6.2 miles long, separating the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And here, channel basically means a narrow stretch of water that connects two larger bodies of water like seas or oceans. The 10-degree channel, also known as the Great Channel or Grand Channel within India's EEZ, is one of the world's busiest trading routes. If India were to block the 10-degree channel, it could pose a significant threat to China by disrupting Chinese access through this area. This strategic position allows India to control or limit movement, which could impact Chinese maritime operations in the region. Similarly, even the 6-degree channel could play a major role in countering China. Why? Because these channels sit near one of the most critical sea line of communications that China uses for trade and oil imports, which is the Malacca Strait. In fact, over 60,000 commercial ships pass through these 6-degree and 10-degree channels each year. So along with Malacca Strait, even the 6-degree channel is one of the main 9 choke points controlling access to this area. In fact, you may be surprised to know that even submarines are said to surface while passing through this checkpoint to prevent accidents. So by controlling these channels, India can monitor, or in extreme cases even restrict, access to the critical routes. Exactly how? From the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India could employ anti-access and aerial denial, or A2AD weapons, to block or limit Chinese ships from entering Indian Ocean waters. Here, anti-access and area denial, or A2AD, is a military strategy to keep enemies out of a specific area or limit their movement within it. Anti-access involves blocking the enemy from entering, while area denial restricts their ability to operate effectively if they do get in. And A2AD zones use weapons like long-range missiles and anti-ship defense to make enemy movements more difficult and risky. But the question is, all this sounds really good in theory, but can India really take action against China? Because if we compare the size of their militaries, it tells a completely different story. Well, have a look at this. According to the Firepower Index, while India's defense budget was $74 billion, China spent 3 times more with a military budget of a whopping $227 billion. In fact, according to a US think tank, China is spending over $700 billion a year on defense, over 3 times the country's publicly stated budget. And if we specifically compare the navies of these countries, while China has 2 aircraft carriers, 3 helicopter carriers, 49 destroyers, 42 frigates, 72 corvettes, 150 patrol vessels, and a whopping 61 submarines. On the other hand, India has 2 aircraft carriers, 0 helicopter carriers, only 12 destroyers, 12 frigates, 18 corvettes, 137 patrol vessels, and 18 submarines. So clearly, China is ahead in numbers. And I actually mean because in quality, this is how it looks like. But anyways, hypothetically, even if India blocks these choke points for China, China can use its military might to fight back and easily break the blockade. Or if we consider a second scenario, where India and China go to war, the Chinese Navy would easily outnumber the Indian Navy and get an edge in the Indian Ocean region, right? In reality, these numbers are misleading. And second, India has a major advantage over China that these numbers aren't showing us. But why did I say that these numbers are misleading? Because in case of an Indo-Chinese war, China can never deploy its entire navy against India because that would be a huge blunder. The reason they won't do this is because they would still have to keep a sufficient number of naval fleet in their home waters to safeguard themselves from a possible US-Japan attack. However big the threat is in the Indian Ocean region, China's primary goal will always be to maintain its presence in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But even if China deploys a significant number of its naval fleet against India, it would be very difficult to win against India because of the geographical edge that India has. You see, the conflict will take place in the Indian Ocean region, which is actually India's home waters. And this one single fact would give India 3 major advantages over the Chinese Navy. Number 1, India would have access to short routes to potential scenes of battle. Number 2, the Chinese Navy would have to travel long distances to access the Indian Ocean, and history has proven that going a long way from home and traveling a long distance for a battle is itself a disadvantage. So short distance always favors the defender and becomes disadvantageous for the aggressor. Number 3, battles over long distances put a lot of strain on resources and create tough logistical challenges. For example, refueling ships. Also, China will always have to maintain a stock of ammunition, fuel, and other war components. And this would be challenging. Whereas for India, this won't be a big challenge. Also, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands would play a critical role, as the military installations there could help keep the Chinese Navy away from mainland India. And this is because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are 1,200 kilometers or about 745 miles away from mainland India. But the question is, even if India is in an advantageous position, and despite all the advantages India has, it would still need a substantial amount of military infrastructure and high-tech weapons to fight the Chinese Navy. So, is India even prepared to give the Chinese a befitting reply? Well, you'll be shocked to know that the Chinese Navy might have to encounter the Indian Navy thrice, even before reaching near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands via the Malacca Strait. Firstly, Vietnam has granted exclusive access to Indian naval ships to use the Nha Trang port in Vietnam. In fact, the Indian Navy has been making regular visits to the southern Vietnam port. Also, Vietnam has asked India to help develop this naval facility. Another reason why this is so special is because the Nha Trang port is located very close to the Cam Ranh Bay port, which is considered as the finest deepwater port in the Indo-Pacific, which is ideal for docking submarines, large aircraft carrier, and other naval ships. And why is Vietnam doing this? Actually, Vietnam sees a partner in India to fight off China in the South China Sea, so it has been improving its relations with India. In fact, there are speculations that an Indian military base in Vietnam might be possible at Cam Ranh port. On the other hand, India and Singapore have signed a bilateral agreement that grants Indian naval ships access to logistical support, including refueling, at Singapore's Changi naval base. So this allows the Indian Navy to maintain a strategic presence near some of the narrowest points of the Strait of Malacca. Next, as we already saw, we have an Indian military base at the Sabang port in Indonesia. Indonesia has agreed to give India economic and military access to the strategic island of Sabang, also known as Hue Island. This was a big deal because this island is located just 710 kilometers, about 440 miles, southeast of the Andaman Islands, and less than 500 kilometers, or 310 miles, from the entrance of the Malacca Strait itself. And now finally comes the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a strategic military asset for India. These islands are home to the only integrated tri-service base of the Indian Armed Forces. This simply means that this is India's only military base where the Army, Navy, and Air Force all work together as one unit. Also, various Indian military leaders have described the islands as an unsinkable carrier. But why? If you have seen an aircraft carrier, it is like a mobile airport in the sea, which allows fighter jets to take off for operating far from the land. And this helps a country extend its reach across the ocean. But in the case of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, these islands are already located at the most strategic location, which is at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, and also at a key location in the Indian Ocean region. The Andaman and Nicobar Command operates 7 military bases, of which 2 are full-fledged Air Force bases, 2 serve as naval air stations for logistics and administration, and the remaining 3 are naval bases or air stations. But what would make these islands extremely lethal are the upgrades they will see in the next few years. For example, in 2019, an exclusive $680.72 million military infrastructure development plan was passed, according to which some of the naval air stations would be having their runways extended. And once the runways are operational, the Indian Navy will be able to operate its game-changer P-8I Poseidon maritime surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft. And the reason I said it's a game-changer is because it's literally a nightmare for the Chinese ships and submarines. In fact, a top Navy officer said that there is no way any country's ships or vessels can pass through the Indian Ocean without being detected by the Indian Navy's P-8I anti-submarine and surveillance planes. And P-8I will not only detect such targets, but will also classify and destroy them by using torpedoes, depth charges, and missiles. Here, depth charges basically are explosive devices designed to combat submarines. Once fully completed, this investment will allow India to station infantry soldiers, missile batteries, more warships, and drones in the Andamans. To make the bases more lethal, the Indian Air Force has also deployed Su-30 MKI and Jaguar strike jets, along with some of the most advanced surface-to-air missiles in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Additionally, the inauguration of the Chennai, Andaman, and Nicobar undersea internet cable would play a critical role in communication. The high-speed internet connects 7 remote islands, which not only gives people better access to communication, but also helps the military by providing reliable communication channels for strategic purposes. Additionally, the Indian Navy has aimed to increase its fleet from 140 to 200 warships by 2027. But surprisingly, it's not just India preparing against China in this region. Japan, the United Kingdom, and Australia have teamed up with India in countering the Chinese submarines. This is because there have been reports that India might consider installing the Japan-US-developed fishhook sound surveillance system, which is a chain of sensors designed to track submarines. Once this system is operational, it is expected to enhance intelligence sharing among Japan, the United Kingdom, Australia, and India, which will create a foolproof counterwall against Chinese submarines in the Andaman Sea and South China Sea. Along with this, the Andaman and Nicobar Command regularly conducts joint maritime exercises with partner nations. One example is the Singapore-India Maritime Bilateral Exercise, or SIMBEX, which helps the Indian Navy and the Republic of Singapore Navy improve their interoperability. India also holds Milan, the largest naval exercise in the region, with navies from all over the Indo-Pacific taking part in a Malabar exercise between the Indian and US Navy. These exercises show that India is committed to keeping the region safe and strengthening its relationship with other friendly nations. Now, along with military development on these islands, India has also allocated a massive $8.67 billion for the Great Nicobar Island. The Great Nicobar project involves developing a transshipment port, an international airport, township development, and a 450 MVA gas and solar-based power plant on the island. Now here comes the interesting part. Experts say that China has found options that might surpass the Malacca Strait. In fact, it has started doing so. One such option is the Gwadar port in Pakistan. As part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, China has developed the port in Gwadar so that goods unloaded there will be shipped directly to the Chinese mainland. According to this plan, a railway will connect Gwadar to Kashgar in China. This project is still not yet fully complete, but once done, it could be a game changer for China. Why? Because while the shipping routes from the Middle East to China via the Malacca Strait is about 12,000 kilometers, or about 7,500 miles long, this sea-land-based corridor via Gwadar Port is basically 3,000 kilometers, or about 1,800 miles. So it not only secures and reduces the passage time for China energy imports, but it would also provide a shortcut to China. So China has been working extremely hard to make this project a success. And that's because completing it won't be easy, like at all. The locals in the region are revolting against the Chinese. In fact, the whole region, known as Balochistan, is a highly unstable region. And this is not only about China and its projects, The rebel groups in this region are also against the Pakistani army. This is because Pakistan have never focused on the development of the Balochistan province, even though they keep extracting natural resources from the region. So even China faces the wrath of their anger. In fact, Pakistan also deployed about 12,000 soldiers to protect the Chinese workers, but still the attacks have not stopped on the Pakistani army and the Chinese workers involved on various infrastructure projects linked to CPEC. But even if China built up the infrastructure successfully, they might not be able to sustain it. The landscape and terrain along the proposed route passes through the Karakoram range, which is prone to frequent earthquakes, landslides, and most importantly, extreme temperatures. So there's a risk of transportation and most importantly, the risk of oil passing through the terrain of getting frozen. And even if they did, their transport costs would increase significantly. It is estimated that transport of a barrel of oil through the sea route could only cost about $2, while this pipeline could cost somewhere between $12 to $15. Now, this might work in emergency situations, but it's not a sustainable long-term solution. Another reason why this port could fail is it passes through the Pakistani-occupied Kashmir, which is a highly unstable region and is also not even a part of Pakistan's territory. It is an Indian region, which is illegally occupied by Pakistan, and so the threat of India recapturing this region would always be looming on China's head. And if this happens, China's billions of dollars worth of investment might go in vain. Another idea China had was to build a canal through Thailand's Kra Isthmus Canal, but it is still far from being a real option because the canal would give China control over Thailand, something Thailand would likely never agree to. One of the successes China has had is the Myanmar oil pipeline to Kunming in China. This is an 1,100-kilometer oil pipeline from Myanmar to Kunming, with a possible extension to Chongqing, with an additional transportation capacity of 22 million tons, or 442,000 barrels of oil per day. Although it's a big success, the oil still passes through very close to Indian waters, making it vulnerable to a potential blockade by the Indian Navy. For now, only time will tell who will emerge as the winner of this India-China tussle.